Good day everyone, and welcome to the channel. It's Londononion here with another Back 4 Blood character build. And the character we'll be building in this video is Sharice. Now generally I would say cleaners fall on a spectrum of roles/categories ranging from offensive, supportive, and defensive. And of course the degrees in between, as we will uncover throughout this series. Just for consistency, I will define offensive roles and perks as abilities that are directly intended to increase damage or bolster offensive capabilities. Defensive roles and perks will be defined as abilities that directly increase survivability from punishment. Lastly, supportive roles and perks are defined as alternative skills that can be instrumentally used for offensive or defensive purposes without a defined intention for either polarization, but are ultimately a helpful perk for one's team. First, we will have a brief overview of our chosen cleaner, go through relevant cards that will either synergize or compensate with their attributes, and conclude with what I consider to be the main tactics to maximize the use of their abilities, as well as my closing statements. Now for those who are present during our weapon reviews and deck builds, each weapon-centered deck build came with character designations. Our format with character builds will be similar, but with more priority to a given character and maximizing their role on a given team. So starting off with the character attributes of Sharice. Sharice has a unique ability to create armor pieces when shot off of Ridden with an undefined probability. She has 25% increased trauma resistance, and she has a team effect of 25% bolstered health. Now in regards to our spectrum, it is the attributes that we will use to designate each cleaner. In Sharice's case, I would classify her unique armor creating ability as a defensive perk, her increased trauma resistance, a defensive perk, and her bolstered health, also a defensive perk. With that said, Sharice is the first of her kind, a hardcore defensive cleaner. Now in regards to card selection, we can compensate with the more offensive and supportive cards, and we can synergize with more related and compounding cards depending on needs and playstyle. And naturally, there is the option of creating a mixture or specialization. But if you ask me, a quintessential cleaner is not one that is good at everything, but one that fulfills their role in the best manner to aid the overall effectiveness of their team. So starting ourselves off with her deck build. As a defensive cleaner, Sharice is made for taking punishment. Her defense is her offense. However, her offense is completely inexistent. Sharice is like the guardian of her team, or at the very least a reliable last resort. If everyone else fails, she doesn't. At least that is what her skill set seems to suggest. Sharice can be considered a strange mixture of Holly, Doc, and Mom. A destined champion in the battle of attrition and survival. Now, with such a specialization, there are a number of avenues Sharice can be built toward and will naturally boil down to preference and perhaps the demands within a given act. So our deck build will have a series of alternative options that I also found to be useful when testing out her capabilities. For those who have been present during our earlier character reviews and deck builds, you'll know that melee-based deck builds aren't my initial instinct, but in having an objective approach, they definitely have their place and sometimes have a place over ranged offensive measures. But with such high defenses, I would consider it a squander of Sharice's strengths to orient her to ranged combat alone. But that is just this onion's opinion. And this will lead us into her tactical implications, which we will discuss a bit later. Moving on to our card selections, our first card is Well Rested, which grants a team effect of 20% team overheal and 5% increased team healing efficiency. Next, Scar Tissue reduces damage by 1 unit from all Ridden and comes with 50% acid resistance. Battle Lust allows melee kills to heal 1 health unit and 0.125 units of trauma. Face Your Fears grants 1 temporary health for every Ridden eliminated within 2.5 meters. Mean Drunk increases melee damage by 40% and deals damage up to an undefined radius. Body Armor increases trauma resistance by 20%. Durable increases trauma resistance by 15% and increases health by 5 units. Ignore the Pain grants an additional 20% melee damage against mutations. This card also heals 1 unit of health and recovers 3 units of stamina for every successful hit. Wounded Animal grants 1 unit of health upon eliminating an enemy while at critical health. Defensive Maneuver increases damage resistance by 25% for 3 seconds upon receiving damage of 15 units or more. Spiky Bits grants an additional 15 units of melee damage, whatever that number means, 20% damage resistance while using a melee weapon, but comes with a penalty of reduced ammo capacity by 15%. Carrying on, we have Vanguard, which grants 1 health unit to oneself and teammates within 10 meters upon a melee kill. Adrenaline Fueled grants 5 units of stamina and an additional 7 stamina over 7 seconds, and this effect can stack up 5 times. Cross Trainers increases stamina and its regeneration by 20%, move speed by 3%, and health by 5 units. Lastly, Brazen increases melee stamina efficiency by 15% and attack speed by 20%. Now for the alternative cards I have considered: Heavy Hitter, Energy Bar, Breakout, Meth Head, Fit as a Fiddle, and potentially Numb. These are cards I would value in exchange for other cards in this current build, but I would consider them as viable preferential options. But anyways, overall, with each melee kill / strike with mutations, Sharice can gain an additional 4 units of health with Wounded Animal activated, and 5 units if counting temporary health. Her melee damage will increase by 60%, plus whatever Spiky Bits offers with 15 units. Unknown if this is a typo. Otherwise, 40% against other foes. Her trauma resistance will increase by 60% and damage resistance will increase by 45% with correct conditions of both Spiky Bits and Defensive Maneuver. Now, the whole idea behind this build is to maximize Sharice's meta with an orientation to melee weapons while being able to withstand and bounce back from harsh punishment. Now, one of the detriments of this deck build is that it does not come with any primary weapon-based cards, and this was intentional. Similar to Holly, Sharice seems best fitted for shotguns and melee weapons, but of course with a greater focus on melee weapons. This is also why I did not correct for the ammo penalty from Spiky Bits. I would argue that the best performing class of weapons without the support of cards is shotguns. High damage and very easy use with reasonable range. This will give her some range ability, but stay true to her orientation without attempting to diversify her skill set at the inadvertent detriment of her specialization. With this current build, she extends her meta from pure defense to offensive defense and defensive support. But this will transition us to her tactical implications and her placement on a given cleaner team. Now, Sharice is somewhat reminiscent of Holly in that they both have congruent recommended loadouts and can excel as pressure fighters. Sharice, however, is further specialized into using melee weapons and sustaining punishment, regardless of whatever threat is in front of her. With the way she is built, there are few threats that would demand ranged combat, and that is particularly with ogres, slashers, and high-level mutations, though the latter may just require softening up. Charging and letting her melee weapons loose against mutations was a surprisingly viable option in eliminating them and maintaining, if not increasing, her health after the encounter. With this strategy, she not only benefits herself, but also passively heals her teammates and naturally can create armor pickups. Such a mode of play works best in circumstances where there is a high volume of ridden, / an endless horde, or dare I say, hags, and breakers, provided they are stunned or distracted first. Alternatively, she can also play a passive anchoring role, where she is the brick wall that a given threat does not penetrate, especially where there is chaos involving incoming threats and incapacitated teammates. In regards to team placement, I would argue that Sharice is best placed in either the Major or Omega position. The Major acts as the leader's backup, focusing on areas the leader is not and providing a strong response to foes that manage to close the distance. The Major, as this onion conceptualizes the role, can also act as a conditional leader where the circumstances demand their skill. Additionally, the Major is the miner's bodyguard, where there may be lateral/blindsiding foes, but ultimately, both positions defend each other. As for the Omega role, this is meant to be a team's rear protection and aid as the miner's defense. Their focus is mainly lateral and backwards. However, as a given team's anchor, Sharice would adopt more of a passive role, emerging where she is needed and potentially being a last resort to a given team's survival. Now, all of the alternative cards we had mentioned earlier following our deck build is what could enhance either the Major or Omega role. Playing as a Major may demand greater stamina with Energy Bar, overall efficiency with Meth Head, and greater resilience with Numb. Alternatively, playing as the Omega may require greater contingencies, such as Breakout, Heavy Hitter for stunning foes, and Fit as a Fiddle for increasing bolstered health capacity. Where these cards would be substituted would be up to each individual, as challenges and demands of given acts will change and I would argue cannot be set in stone. But I would instead consider these to be alternative preferential choices depending on how one wishes to use Sharice. Metaphorically speaking, I would say Sharice can be related to Logan or Wolverine from the Marvel X-Men universe, the unbreakable Luke Cage from the Marvel universe, or perhaps Rocky Balboa from the Rocky movies, especially the fourth one against Ivan Drago. Each archetype being the pinnacle of toughness, perseverance, and strength. Now, everything in this discussion can be taken with a grain of salt, as deck build combinations are too complex for me to fairly evaluate them. However, this is the build I prefer to use when playing on higher difficulties with Sharice. Now, it is paramount to state that team maturity is ultimately what makes any deck work, and for those who were present during our last cleaner discussion, I'm using maturity as an umbrella term to describe each individual's general understanding of roles, navigation, character and weapon attributes, ridden/mutation deterrent tactics, resource management, and ultimately collaboration, as this is a team-based game. I would also argue that the greater one's team maturity is, the greater efficacy specializations, like the ones we just went through, will have, as each person will have a greater understanding of what it means to operate as a unit without being overbearing or breaking roles. Carrying on, less maturity will likely demand more of a compensating build so as to provide support where there are more deficiencies. However, there is far more to compensate with than there is to specialize with, and would create an unnecessarily long discussion. Now, Sharice is only one piece of this giant cleaner pie, but this brings us to the end of our discussion today. Thank you guys for joining me on this one, and in our next video, the cleaner of discussion will be, surprise surprise, Prophet Dan, and we will determine where he sits on our spectrum of roles. It's been Londononion, and I will see you guys next time.